Hello and welcome to season 3 of the ReThink Podcast. I am your host, Cameron Friend. Thank you for joining us again for this conversation. The King Center is debuting a brand new season of the ReThink Podcast, and each month we will have a brand new episode for you that will focus on specific topics ranging from war, racism, voting rights, economic injustice, and a global food crisis, and more. And today, joining me for this important conversation is going to be my co-host and friend, Dr. Vonnetta West.
Thank you, Cameron. Welcome, everyone. We're grateful that you're joining us for this critical conversation about the injustice of war.
Yes, and today we're going to be witness to a conversation about the injustice of war, and specifically the terror that we are witnessing in Gaza, the Sudan, and in Congo. Millions of lives have been affected, and tens of thousands of innocent people have died due to the ongoing fight for land, power, and resources. In particular, the atrocities taking place in Gaza has led to the worldwide activation of young people across the world who are standing in opposition to war and genocide. There are no winners in war, as the bloodshed and death across the world leaves us all empty and desolated. Dr. West, can you please give us a Kingian view on why this conversation is so important for us all?
Cameron, it's critical, very important, urgent even, for all of us to understand the facets of militarism/war, the outcomes, the things that we can do to prevent it, the mentality, the ideology, the thinking that goes into this heightened warfare and militarism that we're seeing across the globe. From a Kingian perspective, of course, there are 3 Kingian evils, as we call them. That means that there are evils based on the teachings of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and they are racism and all forms of discrimination, systemic and otherwise, that becomes pervasive and causes us to put things in place that harm and prevent the progress of other people groups. Then there's poverty, which is, of course, connected to greed and extreme materialism and extreme capitalism. And then militarism or war, this use of weapons of mass destruction and automatic weapons and other forms of weapons that are closely aligned, militarism, war, closely aligned with, interconnected with racism and poverty, causing us not to reach the beloved community that Dr. King talked about. And so today, as we talk about the injustice of war, we want to remember these words from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who said that violence is a descending spiral. We're seeing that across the globe. As you join us, as you're listening, as you share in the chat spaces on YouTube and Facebook and X, and on the kingcenter.org where this is airing today, we want you to put in there in the chat spaces your thoughts about militarism, your mourning as we mourn the loss of lives, and connecting this to Dr. King, where we've seen where people will share that Dr. King would be for militarism. War in any form, in any nation, is absolutely erroneous. From this man of peace, true peace, where we understand we'll have tension. But we invite you in today to this conversation to connect the dots to the other evils, to understand the injustice of war. What are the outcomes? What causes war? And so in doing that today, we want to have our CEO of the King Center, Dr. Bernice King, join in this conversation, a peacemaker herself, a child of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Mrs. Coretta Scott King, the founder of the King Center, who is a part of this vital conversation today that we're grateful that you're joining for. So we'll have Dr. Bernice King join us now as our first guest for this conversation on the injustice of war.
Well, good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, wherever people might be as they listen into this conversation.
Yes, and joining Dr. King today, it's going to be Reverend Jonathan Wilson-Hartgrove. And Jonathan Wilson-Hartgrove is a spiritual writer, preacher, and community cultivator. He serves as the Assistant Director for Partnerships and Fellowships at Yale University Center for Public Theology and Public Policy. Please welcome Reverend Jonathan Wilson-Hartgrove.
Hello, it's a joy to be with all of y'all. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Dr. King, Reverend, thank you so much for being a part of this conversation. Dr. West, as always, thank you for helping to usher this conversation, as important as it is for us all to understand. And I'm going to open it up with the first question, and we can get started here. And Dr. King, I would love for you to have a chance to kind of kick us off. And so when we look out into the world and we have seen the effects of war and militarism, racism, religious violence, land rights on human lives, starting off with the Palestine-Israeli conflict, since the Hamas attack on October 7th, 2023, there have been tens of thousands of Palestinians killed in the aftermath, as well as a targeted food shortage for inhabitants in Gaza. And Dr. King, you have made direct calls for a ceasefire in Gaza and the atrocities that are now being called by many a genocide. How would you describe what is taking place in Gaza, and why is this moment so important for us all?
Well, let me just say, starting out, that this is a very difficult and challenging subject that we're talking about. Difficult and challenging because as a humanity, we have yet to rise to the occasion of understanding the importance of truly valuing human life and understanding the sacredness of it. My father's philosophy and methodology is steeped in that. And so when you look at what's happening in Gaza, holistically, what's happening, it is destruction of that sacred life that we all should understand and be willing to find alternatives when we have these conflicts and when we have these ideological differences. And so what started out as being seen and reported and understood by a lot of people as a terroristic attack has now kind of morphed into the taking of very, I won't even call it innocent because I don't like using that word, but I'll just say civilian life of people who have nothing to do with what happened with the attack and who are just trying to live their lives. And so when you look at that and the number of civilian lives that have happened and the targets, the places that have been targeted, when you talk about hospitals and educational institutions, when you talk about communities where people have known as their home and you are targeting those areas and you're being very deliberate about that, albeit saying that, the Hamas are kind of hiding out in these places. When you're being deliberate like that and not thoughtful enough to say, wait a minute, we have some civilian lives there, then you are now moving into the space that it becomes genocidal. And so, yes, ceasefire indeed is needed. The freeing of however many hostages may remain. But at some point, and I don't want to sound religious here, but at some point, we have to learn to study war no more. Just as Daddy challenged us to study nonviolence, we got to learn to study war no more so that these kind of genocidal acts do not happen, so that we have the heart and the skill and the courage and the strength to create the kind of societies where terrorism has no place to really grow. And so, so that we get into this cycle now of saying, well, we got to get rid of these terrorists. Well, no, in order to get rid of terrorism, in order to get rid of violence, you can't do it with violence.
Mm.
You have to do it with a whole nother spirit and mindset. And so that's what I think we have to begin to think about in this nation and world. I'm always asking people the question, what kind of world do you want to live in?
Mm.
It has to start there, because I think we've accepted violence, as normal. We've accepted war as it has to be. What else can we do? And Dr. King gave us answers. He gave us a blueprint. He gave us a way. And he showed us that a human being, because he was not superhuman, a human being can stand on the side of what's right and what's just, and be willing to take whatever criticisms or hit that you have to take and go the nonviolent way to transform our society. We can do it. He did it. We can do it. So I don't want to go further because I'll say too much.
But Dr. King, to your point, when we start thinking about studying war no more, that's one of the songs we sung growing up in church. I don't know about anybody else's faith experiences, but we would sing, I'm going to lay down my burdens down by the riverside. I ain't going to study war no more. That has a different connotation to me today. As I think about the causes of militarism and the causes of wars, we look at Gaza, Israel, and Sudan and Congo, and maybe thinking about why Sudan and Congo aren't as prevalent in mainstream media as Ukraine, as Gaza. Ukraine suffering today great losses. Sudan, Congo, Cameroon, Ethiopia, Tigray, all over the world, in the United States included, militarism, war. As your father said, Dr. King, wars are poor chisels for carving out peaceful tomorrows. We think they are. There's an illusion that we can get to peace through war, but it's actually not possible. Dr. Reverend Wilson-Hartgrove, what are your thoughts on where war comes from as we're looking at this landscape and everything that's happening in our world? What leads us to this fascination and this idea that militarism is a solution?
Well, I think we all have to be honest enough to acknowledge that violence is right there in the human heart. It's in each of us. And whenever we talk about, the need to find ways to restrain violence and to find this creative alternative that Dr. King was just talking about, we have to take seriously, the victims of violence. I like you all have said that we must work for a ceasefire in Gaza and in Sudan and in other places in this world. That's a moral obligation for people who are committed to just humanity. And if, like me, you're committed to following Jesus, it's absolutely necessary. And we can't forget the victims of violence sort of on the other side. We can't forget the people, family members who still have hostages taken by Hamas. I mean, there's horrible violence at the root of this, which is why I so deeply respect and just want to acknowledge you, Dr. King, in your commitment to this, because your family has suffered violence, more directly than maybe any family in this country. And Reverend Barber and I just published a book called White Poverty. And when we were writing it, we were telling the story of the Poor People's Campaign, and so went back. And for me, it was a powerful experience to go back and to listen to your mother at the Solidarity Day of the Poor People's Campaign gathering in 1968, because it deeply struck me the way she was still grieving, the direct violence that you all had suffered when your father was assassinated, and all that went with that. I mean, the threats that were still very present for everyone in that moment, and how she went and first sang. I went back and listened to her sing, "Come by here, Lord, come by here. Somebody's hurting. Come by here." And in her grief, that ability to connect with the hurting of all those people who were gathered, and to then go on and say, as someone who had so publicly experienced violence, she said, "A starving child is violence." Not addressing poverty is violence. She made these connections about the systemic violence that's at the root of so much of injustice in our world, and was able in her grief to connect with all those people. I think that's a fundamental basis for our commitment to be peacemakers in the world. We got to recognize, this human problem is in all of us, which means we can't write off anybody. If we're going to be committed to our own transformation and pursuit of beloved community, we have to be willing to engage and to do it in suffering love, which she obviously was willing to do. You've been willing to do. I mean, those are the kinds of examples we look to. So I just think about this past weekend. We just remembered the life of Reverend James Lawson and his, incredible witness in this country. I've read where your father said, whenever he was teaching nonviolence, he wanted to be there. He wanted to be on the front row listening. This person who taught so many in the movement, the practice of nonviolence. I was, privileged to get to sit with him myself. And, it just seems to me that his emphasis over and over and over again for decades was to say that in the 20th century, there was, of course, the discovery of the power of the atom and the incredible danger that unleashed with the potential for nuclear weapons that can destroy the world. Right. But equally powerful was the discovery of the practice of nonviolence and the way that can unleash the human potentials for transformation without violence. I mean, that is a revolutionary thing in the history of the world, and that people put it into practice in Gandhi's experiments, in what the civil rights movement was able to do here in this country, and the way that has spread around the world, in no small part thanks to your work at the King Center. That's an incredible gift to the world. And I think we have to do everything we can in the face of so much violence that's consuming so many precious lives to cultivate that gift and to invite people into it and to say, we can't give up. This is still a possibility.
I wanted to add something to what you're saying too, and that is, I don't think people truly stop to think about the cost of violence, war, not just financially, but the moral cost, the generational cost. And so, I was doing a little bit of research, and it kind of revealed that oftentimes when that point is not highlighted enough before, individuals who are in these decision-making places, then it can cause things to go awry. But there are a lot of, what we don't realize, there are a lot of potential wars and acts of violence that didn't happen because individuals had that realization. And so we've got to figure out how to cultivate the higher sense of who we are in the world, so that we'll begin to choose the pathway of peace and the pathway of redemption and reconciliation and the creation of the beloved community. But when I look at what's happening all over the world, and I think about all of this stuff, and I hate to simplify it this way, but for me, a lot of times it's easier to start, and it's not necessarily simple. But if you think about it, the Bible tells us, and I'm not trying again to be religious or Christian, but just coming from my own faith tradition, in Deuteronomy, I've set before you today life and death. Choose life. Every day we have the capacity in humanity, in decision-making places, to choose life. Is it easy? No. But it's doable. We've had examples of people doing it. We have examples of people every day doing it, choosing the pathway of life that values the sacredness of all human life in the decision-making when it comes to these difficult things happening in global conflicts. There's a deficit, if you ask me, there's a deficit of love for humanity in our world. When your love is displaced, then you can easily overlook another person and exploit and oppress, and take advantage of and destroy and kill. But when you have a love for humanity, you can't do that. There's a check mark. Oh, can't go that route. I got to tap into something higher in me. So we've got to call people up into who God created us to be, because we have the capacity within us to love. As we open our hearts to the God or the greatest source of love in this universe, we have the capacity to overcome the decisions that we are making that are destructive. We can make constructive decisions. We can create constructive environments. There's enough resources in this world that we don't have to do land grabs. There's enough space in our human conscience to manage, to balance our diversity. We don't have to agree, but we can still love each other. So anyway, I just wanted to add that bit to the conversation.
And among the many things you both have mentioned, there's this idea that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. talked about with the World House, that all of life is interconnected. We are all interrelated together, and we need each other. And I cannot be all that I can be unless you are all that you ought to be. And when we think about that and all the truth that you're laying out for us, and Dr. King, I would love for you to start with this portion. Why is it then, with all of that being understood, and even just the economic and moral reasons that we're talking about, why is it that war and large-scale militaristic violence is the default setting? Even with all that being true, and we know that, why is it that war is like the default setting for how we handle conflict? And then how would you suggest that we start to rethink our approach to large-scale problem solving?
Well, it's the economics to me. It's follow the money. Love of money is the root of all evil. This is a business. Military weapons. People are making a lot of money off of the production of and the distribution of those weapons around the world. And once I invest like that, I gotta get my return, unfortunately. And that goes back to what we value. Daddy talked about the revolution of values in his book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos Community, that was published 1 year before his assassination. And so, I think until we, again, readjust our mindset, and there's propaganda, the loudest messaging is coming from those who help to undergird and advance, the agenda of those who are seeking to financially benefit, unfortunately, which is a horrible notion, off of the loss and destruction of human lives and civilizations. Because look, there's more money. I can go in and rebuild a society, all those contracts. I mean, you got to think about all of this. And so there has to be a critical mass of us who elevate a new narrative. We have to resound very loudly, that there are, as my brother said, creative alternatives to what is happening. And we got to expose what's going on and not be afraid to expose it. I think that's why my father was assassinated. He exposed what was happening between Vietnam and what was not happening in the United States of America in terms of how we allocated our resources. And so, again, it's going to take a concerted effort to cultivate in people this new way. We are reinforcing violence in our society. That's the only way to solve and address conflicts and problems, and if need be, going to war. We've accepted that, and what makes it the most difficult, and I know this is touchy, and I won't go too far with this, but what makes it most difficult for most of us is we have loved ones who serve, in the military. And so sometimes it feels weird and awkward because my father was asked that question in an interview, about what are you saying to these soldiers, giving their lives. And my father deeply valued the soldiers, and that's why he was speaking about it. Because I don't think anybody wakes up, let me say this, few people wake up every day saying, I want to go destroy human life. And so, it is difficult when you have people who are in these, different areas of our armed services to really speak very strongly in this way, because you don't want them to feel like what they're doing is not a service to humanity. So we got to balance and figure that out as well.
We have to.
Reverend Hartgrove, before you answer, I want to add just if you could consider this in your answer, just the real descending spiral, because what Dr. King just described to me reminds me is the descending spiral is real. When I hear from my Jewish neighbors, what I'm hearing is people who've gone through an atrocity. When I hear from my Palestinian neighbors, I'm hearing from people who have endured atrocity. I have endured violence for a number of years. When you look at Sudan and Congo, of course, King Leopold coming in, enslaving people. Mm-hmm. We have in these instances the horrors of slavery, war, Holocaust, all these different things that have happened. How does that contribute as you consider your answer to the question that Dr. King was just responding to? Because I'm finding that anytime a people group has been gravely harmed, there's a need for self-protection. And sometimes that self-protection can look like other people being harmed, when actually that just adds to the descending spiral. Right. So how do we deal with this outcome of this war when people have been hurt deeply? How do we repair the breach? That's an organization that you're involved in.
Well, you're absolutely right. This is a spiral, and it's a cycle that repeats itself over and over. And it repeats itself because every person who experiences violence internalizes that violence and is processing it. And of course, the promise of nonviolence is a way out, right? The gift of being able to respond to violence with something else. That's what Gandhi called ahimsa. That's the power that reaches down into some new space and finds a creative alternative in response. But in some ways, I was thinking as Dr. King was speaking that we have to find a way to name how the violence has impacted all of us. And so when you were talking about people who've served in the military, it struck me that one thing we can learn from listening to people who've served in the U.S. military in recent decades is this whole category of moral injury. People who have been asked by their government to do things that they know from their own moral center is wrong, experience a kind of internal violence. Now, psychologists are careful to say, this is not the same thing as trauma. People who directly experience violence have trauma and post-traumatic stress and things that are related to that. I mean, the body processes trauma in a particular way, but moral injury is a serious reality that those of us who have been part of a nation and part of communities that have sort of included us in violence without without asking. I think we have to seriously consider how this has impacted us, and this has been part of my own journey. I grew up in the Baptist church in the South with pale-skinned folks like myself who have been told for generations that we were white. But I grew up, in the sort of post-racial era where we weren't talking so much in those terms anymore. As I've come to understand it, there were forces in this country that wanted to maintain power, that decided very intentionally to not use race to divide people anymore, but to begin using our religion. So as what we now call Christian nationalism developed organizations that were reaching out to people. They began to message communities like the one where I grew up to tell us that our Christianity and our commitment to country above all else was, they were closely intertwined. It was a sort of interweaving of a religious identity with a particular understanding of patriotism, one that was often very militaristic. And so in my own experience, when the United States went to war in 2003, over and against the advice of all Christian theologians who said it would be an unjust war, and over and against most of the nations of the world that opposed it at the UN and other places, I found myself in a situation where I had to begin to wrestle with, what does it mean that I am a citizen of a country and a member of a church that blesses and sanctions wars that most people see as unjust? And I, to go back to what I've learned from veterans, I think there's a moral injury entailed in that, right? And that coming to terms with what it means to be a faithful citizen, to be a faithful Christian, to be a just honest human being means grappling with that moral injury and saying, there's a way that someone like me has to be healed from that. But I have to intentionally face the reality of what my country has done and what has been done in my name, and begin to make real amends, right? Begin to develop relationships that help me understand that there are other perspectives. I mean, I am an American. I was born here. This is my nationality, but I'm a Christian, which means I have sisters and brothers all over the world. And I need to be listening to them, listening to their experience. Certainly over these past months, listening to Christians from the West Bank and from Gaza has been incredibly important.
And Dr. King, Martin Luther King Jr., as Dr. Bernice King, CEO of the King Center, referenced earlier, he said, a true revolution of values will lay hands on the world and say of war, this way of settling differences is not just. A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. And so, Dr. King, what are some nonviolent methods of protest or other direct actions that we can deploy to help our leaders, even here in America and abroad, to end their pursuit of unjust war?
Well, I think in the first place, we have to understand from a Kingian perspective, Nonviolence 365, direct action has to be seen and understood in a greater context. It was part of a larger strategy and process. And oftentimes, I think we are lacking the strategy to give the necessary pressure and create the kind of tension that is needed to raise or at least prick the conscience of individuals. If it may not reach those who are in the actual role of making the decision, it could reach those who are kind of on the sideline and can be brought in and become an advocate for getting the attention, may have direct access to those who are in decision making. And so, I don't want to push the issue of let's just protest, because if it doesn't have its proper organization around it, it's not going to achieve the outcome of getting people to really hear. Now, sometimes people feel that violence, some form of protest that has a little bit of violence, can get people's attention. And sometimes from an immediate standpoint, it might have that effect. But nonviolence is a long-term sustainable solution to what we are talking about when speaking of war. So, when I was a college student, I was a part of the South African, the movement, addressing apartheid in South Africa. And as students, we were part of the greater strategy that had been developed around, at this particular stage when I became involved, it had moved to putting pressure on those corporations who were doing business in South Africa. So it was very targeted towards certain industries in terms of boycotting and protesting and putting yourself on the line to raise awareness of the citizenry of what's going on, and that we have to get the attention of our nation to not continue to support that, not just from a governmental or political perspective, but from our corporate perspective. But it was very organized. And eventually we know it became a part of the effectiveness because the whole world began to participate in it. And so nonviolence has to be organized for it to be effective.
Yeah, that's very important. And I would add to that one of the things that I've learned over the years is that for nonviolence to be a real way forward and a way toward the world that we want, its organization has to be not just something that's sort of relegated to, the kind of issue-based stuff we do out in public, but that nonviolence really is a way of life. So if we're going to practice it well in our strategic attempts to interrupt the violence, that's happening very publicly that we see, in other parts of the world or in our neighborhoods, then we also have to be about practicing it every day in our homes, in the way we raise children, in the way we treat partners. These are critical issues. It makes me think of Gandhi's practice over the years of the ashram, and Gandhi as a man of some privilege who had grown up in Indian society, understood his washing of the toilets in the ashram as an interruption of the structural violence that he was habituated in at home. There were all sorts of things that needed to be done on a daily basis in order to sort of get ourselves out of the habits of our culture that we've simply inherited. So the practices of nonviolence are really about how we treat one another in every context of our lives.
Yes.
And then when we move into public issues, we should be very strategic about it. And everything that you're saying about the need to build campaigns and, to have the negotiations in a campaign before we move to that step of direct action. But, in between, before the direct action, to take seriously as a community of people who are going to do it, the spiritual preparation. I mean, I learned from Uncle Vincent Harding and many others that the lunch counter protests were planned for, especially in Nashville, for months in practice, where people people did what they were going to do, in practice, and there were people who realized that they just couldn't maintain discipline. And so they took other jobs. They didn't sit on the stool. They were runners. They were runners taking messages. They were doing other things. And that's critical work to put in that time in order to prepare for effective nonviolent campaigns.
Based on what the two of you just shared, and thank you, there's a need for preparation and for understanding that it's a soul force that we're bringing to bear as we confront injustice. Dr. King called it a soul force. He said we're going to meet this physical force with soul force. How do you do that when it's urgent? As we close out, this conversation, we want to think about the fact that it's airing on Be Love Day 2024, and love is often considered to be just weak and sentimental. But Dr. King said it organizes itself into powerful direct action. And one of your favorite quotes, Dr. Bernice King, is your father saying that justice at its best is love concretized. So what do we do with love in this urgent hour to bring it to bear as we confront militarism and poverty and racism, but in particular militarism? As students protest across this nation, they feel like we got to do something now, and we do. People are losing lives at a not even losing lives; their lives are being taken egregiously at an alarming rate There's an estimate that in the rubble in Gaza, there are over 20,000 children that are not in the number that's being shared for children who are dead, but just in the rubble, some of them still living. As people feel that pressure, of we got to do something, how do we hear each other at the same time that we're doing something and not cause our community to disintegrate even more? How can love help us do that? How can love help us listen at the same time that we're engaged in direct action? How can it help us balance and get to the place where we say we got to stop this loss of life, these deaths, but at the same time, I don't want to keep harming people? And that's, as Dr. King, Reverend Hartgrove, how do we get to principle 3 of nonviolence, where we want to destroy this evil of militarism using love, while at the same time still engaging each other with dignity and with respect? How can love help us?
Takes me back to the urgency of my own student experience and what I was talking about earlier in terms of the war making in Iraq. That was happening when I was a college student. And I'll never forget one of my mentors in nonviolence, Father Dan Berrigan, came to Philadelphia to visit with those of us who were deeply concerned. And he listened and he said, sometimes it's important to remember, don't just do something, stand there for a minute. We often say, don't just stand there, do something. He turned it around. He said, don't just do something, stand here and take a moment to pay attention. What I heard in that was a real call to recognize where I was connected to this violence. And for me, it was deeply connected to my own faith and the way my faith was being used by the President of the United States at the time and others, who called themselves evangelical Christians, to justify war making in another part of the world. And I had to grapple with that. And I had to come to terms with, okay, what can I do as a person of faith to begin to unlearn this violence? And in that context, I prayed about it. I do believe that Oscar Romero from among the Communion of Saints intervened and helped me to discern this. And my wife, Leah, and I went to Iraq. We joined a group called the Christian Peacemaker Teams that were going to be in Iraq while the bombs were falling. We said, we've got to be there. We've got to go and be with the people who are suffering. And it was in that context that I came to understand from people on the ground in Iraq that the practice of nonviolence might not end the war tomorrow, but it had to entail our solidarity with the people who were suffering in concrete ways. And from them and with them, we could learn to hope for a better future. I think at some point, what I heard in Father Dan Berrigan's words was you got to pause and pay attention and to come to understand where you are connected to the violence and how you can begin to practice nonviolence in that space. So that's been my own discernment.
So in addition to what he's just shared, I think there's something that my father left with us as a ongoing challenge, and that is learning how to live together as brothers and sisters so we don't perish together as fools, or as he said in one instance, so we're not forced to perish together as fools. I think, the urgency of do has to be combined with the study of what to do. Oftentimes we can move in a kind of knee-jerk reaction to things, or even go into things with the heart and the mind that I know exactly what is needed, because maybe we are nonviolent practitioners. But my father was very contemplative. I think he was always studying what he was doing, analyzing it, seeking to come up with ways to better refine what was taking place and what was needed. And so I would couple it with everything that he's saying. We have to be present. Love has to show up. It can't just be confined in four walls, but it has to show up. But it has to show up in this kind of learning constant learning mode and making sure that you are constantly aligned with the spirit and the heart of love. So that whole third step of nonviolence, personal commitment, or as they called back then, self-purification, has to remain with you throughout the entire process, because it's very easy, in the midst of things, to turn, to shift, to lose it, and end up becoming like those that you are, seeking to address the injustice that's coming from them. So I think that's so important to this work and to what we're talking about with love. Be love is a constant. It's not past tense. It's not future tense. It just is. Yeah. And all we have is now. So in every instance, everything that's required to be love, which is that purification, which is that continuing to try to understand, learning how to live together. How do we address these injustices and still, create an atmosphere for the person who right now is adversarial, but yet creating that atmosphere so that they even begin to understand that they're part of our greater humanity, that we're interconnected, that we're interrelated, that we're interdependent, that we're part of each other, that we're part of the human family.
Yeah. Yeah, and if we want to be part of a movement that is challenging the kinds of retributive justice that we see, on the world stage that seems so counterproductive and destructive, there's certainly, public advocacy to do on those issues, but you can also practice restorative justice at home, right? I mean, if we really believe that love is the answer, then there's a whole lot of people in our communities who are being thrown away because often they've, engaged in some fairly minor infraction. And to begin to say, well, let's address these issues in our communities and try to find a way to heal the harms that have been done. If we really want that on the world stage, we got to figure out how to practice that in our communities. So doing that with folks who are having disputes in your neighborhood, on your block,
yes.
At your courthouse downtown, is a way to be love, as we continue to hope and believe that we can find ways to do that on the world stage.
And so can I just add this as we close? What he just said and what he has said before is so essential. If there are enough of us who practice nonviolence on a daily basis, in whatever situation, circumstance we are in, whatever relational situation, circumstance that we're in, it will spill over into all of these other difficult and complex social issues that we're addressing, because it then becomes infectious, and it spreads. And then we bring that whole spirit, to the work and the movement to resist and overcome the injustices and inhumanities that are occurring in our world.
Thank you. Thank you, Reverend Wilson-Hartgrove, Dr. Bernice A. King. As we close, let's give some final thoughts, and then Cameron's going to come and close out this episode. I think all over the world right now, people are mourning, considering, grieving the different ways that we are killing each other globally. And so there are people in Sudan now who are suffering, Haiti, because of the exacerbation of violence with handguns and automatic weapons, Congo, Cameroon, the United States. We don't want to leave the United States out. As Dr. King called the United States of America, the government of the United States, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. And even internally, Violence is happening here in various forms on a daily basis, including militaristically. And Gaza, as we look at and remember our neighbors who are in the rubble, our neighbors who every day are facing bombing, as we remember our neighbors who had loved ones taken hostage on October 7th, as we remember those who are unjustly imprisoned by Israel, we remember what Dr. Bernice King just said about how terror forms and how we can cultivate a culture across the world where we end terrorism. I want to share this prayer from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. from a book called Thou Dear God. And as I just want us to hear it as we think about our direct action, how love can show up as the most durable power in the world, as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. called it, and what we can do now, as Reverend Wilson-Hartgrove and Dr. Bernice King just shared, that combination of direct action and study of how to implement nonviolent direct action at the same time, understanding the urgency, but also understanding not just doing something, but doing something effective and that's love-centered and is not destructive, destroying humanity at the same time as we're saying we're doing something to help humanity. Dr. King said, God grant that right here in America and all over the world, we will choose the highway, a way in which all the nations of the world will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks, a way in which every nation will allow justice to run down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. Amen.
Dr. West, thank you so much for that. And what a tremendous way to close out this incredibly important conversation. And you all, if you're watching this on Be Love Day, these are the kind of conversations that we are going to be having on the ReThink podcast in season 3. And if you learn from what you heard today, please make sure that you share, that you like, that you subscribe to the channel. We want to continue to get more and more people involved in the conversation the King Center is having, and we want your voice as well. So please leave your comments. Let us know what your thoughts are on this conversation. If you're listening to this on the audio side, make sure you give us a 5-star review. Make sure you tell people about where they can get the tools they need to engage with their community and the global community at large. Again, I am Cameron Friend, host of the ReThink Podcast. Thank you so much for spending time with us today, and we look forward to seeing you again in the future. See you soon.